Hi, my name is Peter. Welcome to the workshop at Sunny Beaches. In this video, we're going to cover the fifth and final feature of the MiniMax CU300 woodworking machine, which is the horizontal mortiser. If you haven't watched the first video in this series, which is an introduction and an overview of the CU300, I would suggest you start there. The mortiser basically consists of two pieces. There's a chuck here in the end of the jointer planer cutter head, which can accept a bit. And then there's the table, which slides back and forth and in and out. As I mentioned in the jointer planer video, this table is removable, and so I'll show you how that works. The table is held in place by a pair of machine screws, which can be turned with an Allen wrench. The table can then be lifted off the machine. The table weighs a little over 70 pounds. When the table is mounted, it rests on the heads of these two bolts, which are threaded through this piece of metal, and there are lock nuts. If you were to ever find that the mortiser was making slots that were not parallel to the surface of the workpiece, this is where you would make an adjustment to correct that. To mount the table, slide the assembly over the machine screws and let it come to rest against the heads of the adjustment bolts. Then retighten the machine screws. So as you can see, removing and reattaching the sliding table is not particularly difficult, but as I mentioned in the video on the jointer and planer, I usually leave the table attached, primarily because I just don't have a good place to store it, and it's not really in the way, I find. But as I also mentioned in that video, in order to reduce the impact of leaving the table attached, I do partially remove one handle and completely remove another, and we need to reattach these. So as you can see, the lever that controls the left and right motion of the table does stick well up above the plane of the work surface of the machine and would frequently be in the way if I left that attached. And the lever that controls the in and out motion sticks out far enough that I'd bump into that pretty often as well. Before I got in the habit of removing that lever, I used to put a tennis ball on the end of it, which did help. And this actually situation would be even worse if it was a one-piece unit, but there's an extension handle that goes on there that, well, it's removable, so it shortens the handle a little bit. So when cutting a mortise, of course, it would be very handy to be able to clamp your workpiece to the surface of the table. And MiniMax provides a way to do that. The clamp head assembly is actually the same head that we used on the slider. So there's only one of these that comes with the machine. But they do provide a second post for use here on the mortising table. And I'm not sure why, because the post that we used on the slider would also work here. The threads are appropriate. But they did. So there's a hole here in the surface of the table, and the post just gets screwed in. When cutting mortises, we want to be able to set up the machine so that we get repeatable accuracy with regard to the length of the mortise slot we make. And these two rods are part of the solution to that. There are holes in each side of the table that will accept the rods, and there are knobs that will lock the rods in place. under the table, the ends of the rods will come in contact with the part of the assembly that moves in and out with the table, but not left and right. So the effect of this is the rods will now limit the travel left and right of the table. So we'll revisit the rods in a bit, and I'll show you how I go about getting those set accurately. In some instances, you may want to limit the depth of a mortise cut. And for those cases, there is a collar and locking knob which you can set to limit how far in the table will go. Once again, there is a shaft for attaching our crank handle. And just for the sake of consistency, I suppose, one full revolution will raise or lower the table by 2 millimeters. The dust collection port for the mortiser is here at the bottom. So one more thing you need to have in order to cut a mortise is some tooling. This is a set of bits that I purchased from MiniMax at the same time I bought the machine. There are 5 bits in the set, ranging from 1/4 inch up to 3/4 of an inch. As I hope you can see, these are a little bit different than a drill bit, and they need to be because they have to be able to cut in a plunge similar to a drill bit, but they also need to be able to cut side to side. One thing I should point out about this set of bits is that they all have the same diameter shaft of 1/2 inch, regardless of the size of the cutter. And while a smaller diameter shaft would work okay for the smaller bits, a bit much larger, or a shaft much larger than 1/2 inch would be too big to fit in the chuck. So we've once again removed the cover here on the end. In theory, you can install the bit with the cover in place, but once again, I find it easier to do it with it removed, and besides, you can see what's going on a little better. We'll install the 1/4 inch bit. Just insert it into the chuck and tighten, and then replace the cover, of course. There are, of course, any number of methods you can use to establish the proper height of the table for the mortise you're making. In our case, we're going to make a 1/4 inch mortise in a piece of 3/4 inch stock. So we know there should be 1/4 of an inch of material remaining on either side of the mortise, which means there should be 1/4 of an inch between the bit and the table. So I'm just going to use this 1/4 inch setup block and raise the table until we get just a little bit of drag there. There is no locking mechanism for the height adjustment, so at this point I'll just remove the handle. The next step of the setup process is to get our stop rods set so that we get a mortise of the appropriate length. Generally, when I do mortise and tenon joinery, I use what's called a floating tenon, which means I put a mortise into both pieces to be joined, and then use a third piece of material which goes into both mortises. And this is a piece of the stock I use for that floating tenon. And so the width of this material represents the length of the mortise we want to make. A feature of the table I want to point out here is that there's a lip here, and stock can register against that lip. And we're going to make use of that right now. We've got a couple of pieces of scrap that have 90-degree corners on them. And we're going to clamp one to the table. And then shift the table until the bit registers against one of those pieces. Slide in the rod until it hits its stop and tighten it down. Then use the floating tenon material as kind of a spacer. Slide the other piece of scrap in and move the table until the bit registers against the second piece of scrap and then tighten the other rod. And now the amount of travel should be set properly to give us a mortise of the appropriate length. So our last setup issue relates to where along the length of our workpiece will the mortise appear. This thread, block and rod assembly can be used in conjunction with the jointer fence or the table saw fence to eliminate any flex in those fences. But we can also use it here as a stop. The threads here will match the threads here. So say if we wanted one end of the mortise to be 3/4 of an inch from the end of the workpiece, we could take a 3/4 inch setup block and place it against our bit and take our stop rod and place it against the block and make sure our table is slid all the way to the right, and then tighten the knob to lock in the stop rod. Okay, we're finally ready to cut a mortise. So we'll take our workpiece and register it against that lip and then slide it up until it hits our stop rod and clamp it into place. So as I said, the mortising bits do allow for plunging, but only a little bit at a time. So the technique is to go in a little, go back and forth, go in a little bit more, back and forth, and repeat that process until you've gone in as far as you can go. So there's our mortise and our floating tenon. So that pretty much wraps up our series on the MiniMax CU300 European style 5-function woodworking machine. Table saw, shaper, jointer, planer, and horizontal mortiser. I hope you enjoyed the series. I've had fun making it. There are a couple of enhancements that I've made to the machine over the years that I think do warrant another couple of videos. And since there's 2 feet of snow outside, I don't have much else to do. If you watched the entire series on the CU300, you may recall that in the episodes on the table saw and the jointer planer and the shaper, we took a rough sawn board and processed it for what I called my one-board project. And it may have occurred to you to wonder what a one-board project could possibly be, so I'll show you. I'm going to be installing some new coat hooks in our entryway. And I really hate trying to firmly attach anything directly to sheetrock. So instead, I am going to attach this board to the studs in the wall and then attach the hooks to the board. The hooks are at 8-inch intervals, which means every other hook will be at a 16-inch interval, which is the same as the spacing of the studs, which gives us the opportunity to hide the screws that attach the board to the wall behind the hooks. This is the existing set of coat hooks with just a pine board and some kind of ugly hooks. So we'll take that down first. And there's our new board attached in the same set of holes as the old one. And now we'll attach the hooks. So there's the completed project. I hope you can agree that it's an improvement. So thanks for watching and hope to see you again soon.